Thank you so much. I'm just sorry I don't have the ball still. I wanted to keep the ball up. A few years ago, actually in 2012, I began a new department at MoMA, a department of research and development that was meant to study the museum at large and its position in society. Inspired by the title of this conference, What Design Can Do, I started thinking of what museums can do. I started thinking about the perspective of museums exactly in this particular direction, and I swear to God that it came from your conference, Richard. One of the initiatives that I began, not as R&D, but rather as A&D, architecture and design, I merge them whenever opportunistically I need to, is this quite incredible project about design and violence. I say quite incredible because I began it kind of rebelliously because I didn't want to ask anybody whether I could do this project, so it's a WordPress site, the simplest thing in the world. I joined teams with a co-curator, Jamer Hunt, and we started just looking at objects that have an ambiguous relationship with violence in order to explain the manifestations of violence in contemporary society. The prompts for this new project were two. The first, very scholarly, a new book by Steven Pinker, who is a scientist at Harvard, who argues, it's a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. He argues that our society is becoming less violent, that we're shedding less blood, that there's less physical violence, and of course, I would never dare argue with somebody like Steven Pinker. I don't have the data, I don't have the brains, I don't have Harvard behind me, but you know what? I felt queasy about that statement, and I decided to do what I know how to do as an idiot savant, is to look at things and try to understand the world through things. So I started looking for these objects to understand better. The second prompt is a prompt that I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is the 3D printed gun. When it came out, my jaw dropped. It literally dropped. And as soon as my jaw dropped, I also looked at myself in the mirror and said, "You're so naive." Of course, says who that anything that comes out of design, any new technology, is for the good? History teaches us that any technology, any design innovation can be flipped on the other side. But I had never thought about it. So my naivete, a great Harvard professor waking me up, just let me think of this particular project. And it was quite amazing to be able to ask the serious, difficult questions that I had always asked myself. As an Italian, a European living in the United States, I have this daily problem with the idea that death penalty is even discussed in American society. It's almost like a visceral reaction, and I would like to talk about it, but how? Well, we can talk about it through design. Or can we design a violent act to be more humane? Is violence always something that is 100% brutal? Can it be less brutal and more humane? And you'll see which objects help me think about these particular issues. Or is euthanasia a form of violence or a form of compassion? That's another big question that we ask ourselves all the time. Or what other secretive acts carried out on behalf of the public need to be made more visible? And in this case, the prompt was Stuxnet. So you realize there's an object for every question, and it's beautiful to think in that way. Stuxnet for the secretive acts, the redesign of the slaughterhouse by Temple Grandin for the violent act more humane, execution being always ugly, you will see it later, and euthanasia, also beautiful examples. And so many questions came about. So together with Kate Carmody, curatorial assistant, and Michelle Fisher, an exhibition coordinator, we started putting together this amazing list of objects that make us think about things twice. Just to give you an example, there are these green bullets that the US Army is developing. They are lead-free, so they're safe for the environment, but you'll be dead. You know, so there's so many of these objects. And the interesting thing is that much as what happens in this conference, you know, when we think about design, we always, and especially curators in art museum, think of aesthetics too. So the wonderful thing about this particular website is that the design objects that are chosen are all quite impeccable, or at least at the upper line of quality when it comes to design. You know, violence is a Darwinian normalcy. It's something that we've been used to since the beginning of mankind. It's something that we deal with, but at the same time, we're ambivalent about. I just finished reading, you'll think that I'm so pathological myself and kind of sick, but I just finished reading this amazing book called The Psychopath Whisperer, which talks about what happens when our limbic system is completely deprived of feed, of nourishment since the beginning of birth, since the beginning of our life. Some people argue that it's genetic, some argue that it's something that happens at birth. But what happens when violence is let free, when it can flow freely without any kind of inhibition or obstacle? And it's something that sociologists and anthropologists have studied forever. And by means of these objects, we can think about it more. Look at some of the objects in our archive. We started this project in November of last year. So you see there's a menstruation machine by Sputniko that enables one, actually usually a man, to experience a period by, it's a beautiful chastity belt-like object that it has electrodes that go lower down on your abdomen and give you cramps. It has a reservoir in the back, so the guy is supposed to draw blood, put it in the reservoir, it gets delivered by a cannula in between the legs. It's the whole shebang. Then, there's the digital attack map that Google Ideas put together that shows all the denial of service attacks that happen in the world in real time, or the 3D printed gun itself, and so on and so forth. Many different objects that are both of really practical and real design, and other that are real but critical speculative design. So all the sides of the spectrums. The trick is, why did we do this project online? Why is it not an exhibition? It's hard for curators to get rid of the fetish of the physical exhibition. It is something that we're used to. It's a little bit like when authors used to say, oh, we want to write a book because a book is what remains on the shelf. As curators, we keep on thinking that unless we put things in a box, and a box can be visited by physical human beings, we haven't done our job. But in truth, if what we want is really to have a dialogue, the web is one of the best platforms to use. In this case, every object was accompanied by a commentary by a person that is an expert in violence because she or he has either studied it, experienced it, and written about it, spoke about it, or is just contemplating it using the means at her or his own disposal. So we started out with this very ample definition. And once again, this is a journey that helps us understand violence better. So at the beginning, we define it as the manifestation of the power to alter the circumstances around us against the will of others and to their detriment. It's a form of violence that is imposition. It's a form of violence that takes many different manifestations. It can be about stunning. It can be about manipulating and controlling, about penetrating, about hacking and infecting, exploding, intimidating, or constraining. And you see, this is the curators at work. Jamer and I, actually it's Jamer. Jamer is a god. I work in a completely chaotic, or we can call it cutely organic way, in the sense that I just gather things and then they sift there. And instead, Jamer came in and he made this beautiful diagram. This is real, this is imagined, this is mass, this is individual, and everything fell into place. So that you always should work with somebody that's smarter than you. But the beautiful thing is that the first object that we decided to publish is an object that is a new form of design. I do believe that scent is a form of design. I mean, if I had to talk with Lucas, I stop design where the senses stops, So I have a real problem with design thinking, but we'll talk about it another way. I need some sort of manifestation. In this case, it's the scent of violence distilled by our own Sissel Tolas. I'm sure that you all know her, scent artist and designer who works in Berlin. She went to cage fights and picked up the towels left by the fighters afterwards, after the fights, and then used this really sophisticated technology that kind of captures the scent of live beings, gardenias or, like insects. She used them for this sweaty, disgusting towels, and then distilled this infernal stench into this bottle. So we took the infernal stench and we sent it to this great journalist, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who wrote a beautiful piece about violence, the essence of violence, the essence de violence in a way. And then we asked at the end a question, because that's the final trick of this particular project. At the end of each post, we ask a question. And in that case, the question was, is violence male? Wow, that opened up the gates and the comments came flowing in. Second was a visualization of prison expenditure in different blocks in cities of the United States. Commentary by Steven Pinker himself, because of course when somebody creates problems for us, we have to involve the person and help us deal with the problems. Third was The Stiletto Heel by Camille Paglia. Camille Paglia, for those of you who are not Americans, is an amazing feminist, a social commentator, really incendiary. And you see, most of the objects that we chose were after 2001 because we consider 2001 a watershed for the understanding and the perception of violence in the United States. Of course, as Europeans, we've been used to terrorism before 2001, but for the US, that's it. And then, of course, there are some exceptions, like the Stiletto Heel. Or even, I'm very proud, we also were able to co-opt William Gibson to write a commentary about this beautiful work by artist Trevor Paglen. So all of the writers were asked by us to do work, and in some cases they were not writers, they were illustrators like Christoph Niemann. So Keynote doesn't support GIF, so I'm going to do the GIF myself. Okay. The objects chosen were highly symbolic in some cases, like the box cutter in the United States has become synonym with 9/11. Even though it's not proven that the terrorists really used box cutters to get the planes down, people do think that way, so we're using that kind of fascination. And the question was, which other invisible everyday objects can become lethal weapons? And people thought and sent us commentary. The Digital Attack Map by Google Ideas, as I mentioned to you, it's about tracing denial of service attacks in real time all over the world. The commentary was by Gabriella Coleman, and the question was, are denial of services attacks the most violent online threat, or is there something even more threatening out there? No, big questions once again. Beautifully, we always had to find design objects. You know, in some cases we had the issue first and then we looked for the design objects. For the debt crisis, which is so complicated for lay people like me to understand, you know, when you talk about collateral debt obligations, you usually think, I mean, my metaphor in my mind is a polpettone, you know, a meatloaf, you know, so I think, okay, you take all of the different waste and you put it together, then you slice and you sell the slices. Well, somebody visualized it better than I can with my polpettone, and Jonathan Jarvis did a beautiful visualization, and the commentary was written by Gillian Tett from the Financial Times, who not only was impressed by the visualization, she was impressed by the whole project, and she published a blog on the Financial Times. So interestingly, this little ball of snow became an avalanche after a while, still in its WordPress, and you see the question here, since we define violence as a manifestation of the power to alter circumstances against the will of others and to their detriment, can we regard the financial sector's action that led to the credit bubble as episodes of overt violence? How many of you have thought about this? I have been outraged by the fact that the financial and industrial sector are considered to be contributing to the bottom line of society much more than the cultural sector, just because the cultural sector dumbly doesn't have the figures to support its amazingly fundamental contribution to progress. So I'm sure that many of you I'm sure that many of you have had these questions in their mind before. The funny thing is that sometimes we could not control the dialogue. This speculative design project by Michael Burton and Michiko Nitta, which is about a dystopian society in the future, the commentary was by John Thackara, who is very well known to you, highly polemical and adored individual. He wrote a negative comment, and the debate went really all over, and it was not about this particular project, it was about the power of critical design. Is critical design an empty exercise, or does it really contribute to the discourse? And the comments are still ongoing. I really wish you can all go online and take a look. This object also really exploded online. Is euthanasia a form of violence or a form of compassion? This is one of my favorite objects. It's the euthanasia coaster. It's a roller coaster that's supposed to kill you by depriving your brain of oxygen gradually. So it's almost an elation. It's a beautiful death. And of course, it sparked a lot of conversation. This site is considered almost for us a universal donor, almost like a zero-positive blood group. So at some point, we decided to also do some live debates, see how it went. I don't know if you've ever tried the Oxford-style debates. They're quite amazing. the moderator in the middle with a lectern, and then the two podia, and pro and con, emotion. It was great. And we decided to take objects as prompts, once again, to discuss open source, empathy, and the idea of eating animals. The first debate was about the 3D printed gun and open source. Once again, I told you how dumbfounded I was when the 3D printed gun came out, because when we talk about open source, we think of great projects. So the motion was, we cannot limit open source design even when we do not support the consequences. And I was telling you, when I think of open source, I think not of this 3D printed gun, but rather I think about the iWriter project, about hackers and designers coming together to help not only a graffiti artist from LA that's paralyzed in bed, and to help him write and tag a building downtown LA with his eyeballs, thus helping people that are paralyzed all over the world and letting them have the power to actually write and communicate for $60 instead of the customary 10,000 that those systems cost. I always think of these beautiful things. I don't think of this. Sound, please. The sound is important. Yeah. Wait, it's not over. That's Cody Wilson. That's his real video. It's not a parody. Chin up. The logo of his company. So we're talking serious, right? The second debate was about empathy, and the prompt was My Beloved Menstruation Machine by Sputniko, who's actually Hiromi Ozaki, who was an RCA Design Interactions graduate. That's my beloved design interactions at the RCA. I'm almost like an honorary student there. And now she's teaching at the Media Lab at MIT. Oh, what did I do? Did I do something wrong? Can we go back to my menstruation machine? Okay, thank you. So the debate motion was, design's potential to transcend gender boundaries is limitless. Is that real? Do you believe it, or are you on the fence? And here is the menstruation machine in its glorious presence at the Talk to Me exhibition at MoMA in 2011. The debaters dealt with something like, this Schwarzenegger movie and the idea of men becoming pregnant, which is many women's dream, or just the fact of prosthesis and augmentation and how human beings can be changed by this, or even this great Barney Spring 2014 ad campaign that is all executed by Bruce Weber with transgender models. So the changing idea, the changing perception, and the overflow of genders into each other. Third debate, eating animals, Temple Grandins, the animal scientist, the autistic animal scientist that redesigned the slaughterhouse so that cows do not get scared because they do not perceive that death is just a few meters ahead of them. Is that cynical? Is that good? Does that make death more humane? And the debate motion was, design can allow us to humanely include animal products in our diet. So you see, it's quite amazing. Then there were provocation, meat a go-go, just a great big slide of bacon. There's new games for pigs to grow with us and have a good life before we slaughter them. And also the whole debate about meat in vitro, which is so important here in the Netherlands. So for the whole debate online, the one that gave the commentary was Ingrid Newkirk, who is the founder of PETA. And vegan are pretty fundamentalist, so the debate online went on forever, and it also happened in the salon itself. I wanted to show you a little bit of the debates. Could you please up the volume for me?
And I am introducing you here tonight to the third of our first series of debates about design and violence.
My name is Jamer Hunt, and when I'm not moderating debates on menstruation and violence, I am the director of the graduate program in transdisciplinary design at Parsons, the New School for Design, just down the street. Ever since I was a gangly adolescent boy growing up in a town in New Hampshire, I've dreamt of moderating a debate on menstruation at the Museum of Modern Art. The moment is finally here.
Is that I think you have to really decide, do I want, so here's like
This is
untraceable guns made at home. Good idea, bad idea. If you think it's a bad idea, you can't be for open source design without limits, period. If you think it's a good, if you think that open source design without limits really means that, then you have to support the idea of an untraceable 3D gun printed in someone's garage.
Well, we've come to the end of this amazing debate, and yes, I want them to vote. So I'll remind you the motion. The motion is we cannot limit open source design even when we do not support every consequence. And you have your pieces of paper. It's blue for, yellow abstain, and red is
You can't
against.
abstain, though.
Oh,
You cannot
you
abstain.
can. I mean, it would be
Come
better
on.
not. Let's
we just
see.
sat here for an hour.
Raise them.
Letting it all out.
Let's
no one's going to
raise them.
abstain. Oh, look at you.
Well, I think what's important here is Mickey doesn't speak for women. So he doesn't don the blouse or carry the bag and say, now I get it. And that's what I was railing against, is this experiencing something partial and then which you interpret as total and then authorizes you to speak for another. And I think that's especially dangerous when there's a power dynamic between somebody that occupies a position of power in culture and someone that occupies a less position of power in culture. So Mickey acknowledging his social location, to use the sociological term, is precisely the piece that I think often gets lost. And that's the hazard I'm trying to point out.
Well, and I think being a large and in charge person myself, I think the example of the housewife wearing a fat suit really hit home for me because, as you say, it's, Tyra Banks did the same thing, and it's, it's like, oh my God, what a Mother Teresa, she was fat for a day.
Right.
How did she survive?
While there's...
Meanwhile,
Yeah.
I'm available. I'll walk around and be the fat person for free, and I'll bring my own catering, you know what I mean?
So you see, the trick of the trade is that in the debate, people are not black or white. They're black and gray. Like if you look at the first debate, Cody Wilson, of course, is the crypto anarchist, he has the DD logo and everything else. But Rob Walker, my beloved Rob Walker, one of the best design and consumer culture commentator I know, could be the crypto anarchist himself. That's the trick. And in the debate about the menstruation machine, we have the head of the Menstrual Society of the United States. It does exist. She's an academic. And then we have the editor, the editorial director of Paper Magazine, who's been just like donning his women's blouse since the 1980s. So we're talking about people that are on the fence, that are not completely opposed. And the debates were amazing, and we plan to have more in the fall, and we'll use Stuxnet to talk about violence online. But what I wanted to really prove with this project, which was a work of love, a WordPress site, so no bells, no whistles, is that this is what design can do, and this is what museums can do. They can help us talk about really, really serious issues. Thank you very much. Well,
thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I wonder, when you started this project, you had a lot of questions about violence and the relationship between violence and design. Has it already given you any answers?
Has it given, one of the biggest question marks for Jamer and Kate and Michelle and myself is when do we stop and how do we measure success, right? So personally, I have understood much more, but I never look for answers. I look for metabolism, always. That's my way of life. I think that at some point we might send out a survey to some people and find out if we can measure how things are going. But at this point, I can tell you, yes, I got a lot of semi-answers. I get closer to the answer, which I think I will get in my afterlife, because I do believe in it. Not really. Yes. I think that, I said it before, heaven is curiosity satisfied. So in my afterlife, I'll get all the answers.
So, but one answer, maybe your perception is going to change during this project about open source, because we heard a lot of people. What do you think about this, about the open source?
I think that open source is the same as libertarianism. I am oddly attracted to it, even though I know that it's wrong. You know, so it's very funny. You know, there's always, once again, different shades of gray that are about our moral sense and about our desires and wishes. That's why Rob Walker is my hero, because he's able to like walk this fine line. He's one of the most moral and ethical people I know, but at the same time he recognizes how in some of the dark disciplines, in the dark wallets and in all these different sites, there are qualities that we might aspire to.
Yes. Okay. I also think it's all about the perception of violence, and of course the perception of violence is, or I think, is different in Europe than in the United States. Do you get different reactions from Europe than from the United States?
Well, yes, but you know, the United States is huge.
Yeah.
And there
That's
are
true.
pockets in which having a gun is absolutely normal,
Yes.
and in which the death penalty is just the form of, not even deterrent. I mean, to me, the question about the death penalty is not just knee-jerk, it's really logical, and instead for them the logics go the other way.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm always amazed by whenever you launch a question that is about euthanasia, they're really kind of against, but death penalty, they're all against. But at the same time, you open the first page of the New York Times and you read about this inmate that took 40 minutes to die.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like creepy. So it's a complicated country. It's a wonderful country, and I'm a New Yorker more than anything else. New York is
Would it be
safe.
imaginable? Would it be imaginable that you expose a gun in the MoMA?
Well, the first thing, I've been at MoMA 20 years, which is embarrassing, but one of the first objects that I proposed, it's very funny, was a Beretta, right? And I was told no. And I was like, why no? Well, while there's a lot of representations of guns in the collection of painting and sculpture, you know, we have beautiful, the Richter series of the Baader-Meinhof, I mean, there's a lot of representation of violence. Design is different, because in the design collection, what you see is what you get. Right? There's no representation, there's no, I mean, there used not to be this kind of layer of meaning. So morally, because modern design also had an ethical part to it, morally, weapons were a no-no. But we have a crossbow that they consider sports. I mean, it's really, but no, the Beretta didn't fly.
Oh, okay. No. Well, maybe after the project.
I don't know, but not the 3D printed gun is not good design enough. It's not, I'm sorry, it's not beautiful enough. I mean, if they do a better 3D printed
maybe,
gun, I
yeah,
can think
okay.
about it. But
So I was looking for answers from the questions from the audience. I didn't see any question, but David, you had something about the menstruation machine, I think.
I thought it was very interesting, but the menstruation machine. But does it fit? Where does it fit into the violence debate?
Well,
because it seemed to fit into a gender debate, surely.
well, but gender sometimes is violence. So if there's a problem of violence and, you know, like imposition between genders, maybe that kind of empathy and communication can help resolve it. Also, the funny thing is that I've been dealing with this menstruation machine since 2011, and I've seen men seriously crept out by it. They're not even smiling. They feel violated by it. So I realized that it's a violent instrument. You know, sometimes when you force people to understand something, you violate them. And maybe that's necessary or not. So even though it's very ambiguous, ambiguity is something that we really welcome, I considered it a violent instrument.
And you mentioned John Thackeray's sort of question to you, you know, is this narcissism? You know, are we preaching to the choir? I mean, you have your role at MoMA is very much about a conversation with a very broad public. How are they being? How much is this a conversation with your public as much as it is within a design community?
No, it's very wide. Yesterday I was crying, seriously, and I might cry even now, but I won't. Because Michelle sent me from New York a note saying, look at the euthanasia coaster comment. There was a comment from a terminal patient that has nothing to do with design, and she was saying, people don't understand, death is not a tragedy. You know, so she was arguing in support of the euthanasia coaster. So this is not my design audience. It's really funny. And also with the kind of people that we chose to write, we reach much wider audiences, because Ingrid Newkirk tweeted out to the PETA members, and the Euthanasia Society of the United States tweeted out to its members. So we consider this website a very powerful tool of dissemination.
Okay.